There is a specific kind of silence that only exists when the sea fog rolls into the Pacific Northwest. It isn't just quiet, it's thick. It smothers the sound of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below the cliff's edge, turning the world outside into a blank, milky void. When I bought this coastal house, I thought the isolation would help heal the burnout that had systematically dismantled my career as an architectural draftsman. The structure was a skeleton: unpainted drywall, exposed wooden framing, and raw timber floors that groaned under the slightest weight. I told myself the renovation work would give my hands something to do. I told myself it would be a safe place for my son, Toby. But that fog, it does things to your perception. It trickles through the gaps in the window frames, bringing the scent of dead salt water and rotting kelp right into the hallways. It started on a Tuesday evening. The rain had ceased, leaving only the heavy, weeping mist pressing against the glass. Toby was sitting at the temporary plywood table in the kitchen, his small legs swinging rhythmically under the chair. I was frying eggs on the portable gas stove, the blue flame the only sharp color in the entire room. "Dad?" His voice was small, muffled by the vast, hollow space of the uncarpeted house. "What does the Night Stalker look like?" The spatula froze in my hand. A tiny prickle of cold traced its way down my spine. The Night Stalker was just a piece of local coastal folklore, a campfire ghost story the fishermen used to scare tourists. I hadn't realized he'd heard about it. "Nothing, Toby," I said, forcing my voice to remain even, trying to project a calm I suddenly didn't feel. "It's just an old story. It's just an expression people use when the fog gets too thick." "But what does it want?" he asked, his wide eyes reflecting the blue glow of the burner. "Just to scare people who don't finish their breakfast." I attempted a light, breathy chuckle, but it felt hollow. I slid the plate in front of him and pressed a kiss to the crown of his head. His hair smelled faintly of dust and damp wood. I thought that would be the end of it. I desperately needed it to be the end of it. But the house didn't care what I needed. By midnight, the fog had completely swallowed the property. You couldn't see past the porch railing. I was preparing for another sleepless night in my own room, but a routine wave of parental anxiety compelled me to check on Toby first. It was a habit born of loneliness, the simple protective urge of a single father. I stepped across the creaking threshold of his bedroom, the floorboards complaining beneath my bare feet. The moon was a faint, milky smear behind the fogged window panes. And then, my heart stopped. Sitting on the very edge of Toby's mattress, just inches from my sleeping boy, was a figure. My brain completely misfired. For a fraction of a second, I thought it was a thief. But the human mind possesses an ancient, hard-wired radar for things that violate the laws of nature, and that radar was screaming. It was completely naked, completely hairless. Its skin possessed the sickening, bloodless pallor of a drowned fish, slicked with a greasy sheen that caught the faint moonlight. But it was the proportions that broke my understanding. The limbs were impossibly long, stretched out like pulled taffy, and the joints were turned entirely the wrong way. It was rocking, backward and forward, a rhythmic, hypnotic tilt that made the rusted springs of the mattress hiss in the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear into the room and tackle the intruder, but a primal, paralyzing terror locked my knees. My breath caught in my throat like a shard of glass. I felt a sudden, humiliating warmth spreading down my thigh, and I realized I had pissed myself. The thing suddenly stopped rocking. With a wet, clicking sound that echoed in the bare room, its head jerked toward me. It didn't have a human face. It was a warped, featureless mask of flesh, its jaws slung too low, moving with the jerky, erratic hitches of an insane marionette dancing on a dark stage. Toby was right there. His small face was turned toward the creature, his eyes wide open in the dark, staring blankly at the monstrosity hovering over his bed. That sight broke my paralysis. I let out a ragged, choked cry, lunged forward and scooped Toby off the mattress. He felt impossibly light, almost weightless in my frantic grip. I bolted back into the hallway, my heels slamming against the cold timber, waiting for the wet slap of elongated limbs pursuing us. But when I turned around, the creature wasn't pursuing me. Moving with a sickening stop-motion cadence, shuffling and bending in ways that defied human anatomy, it skittered across the floorboards. It reached the high transom window, squeezed its fluid, boneless mass through the narrow opening, and vanished into the devouring fog outside. Only the billowing plastic sheeting over the unfinished window marked its passage, flapping like a dying wing in the cold coastal wind. The sheriff's deputy sat at my temporary kitchen table, his uniform a sharp, aggressive blue against the raw, unpainted plywood. He didn't understand. I could see it in the way his pen hovered over his notepad, waiting for words I couldn't form. How could I explain the wrongness of that shape? How could I tell him that the thing which sat on my son's bed moved like a broken doll and squeezed through a gap in the glass that shouldn't have accommodated a dog, let alone a man? So I lied. Toby had already told them it was a man in a rubber mask, and his small, innocent voice carried more weight than my trembling, sweat-drenched hysteria. A burglar, I echoed, my throat dry as ash. A drifter in a mask. The lie felt like a physical sickness in my chest, a betrayal of my own senses. The sheriff's deputy searched the fog-choked perimeter, found nothing, and left. The next day, I spent money I didn't have to install heavy iron bars over Toby's windows and deadbolts on every door. The house, once an open canvas for my architectural dreams, became a cage, a fortress. But cages don't just keep things out. They trap you inside with whatever's already there. 2 weeks later, the silence truly began. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was an abrupt, terrifying severing of sound. Toby stopped talking, entirely. At first, I told myself it was just a delayed trauma response. Kids go through phases. But by the 5th day of total muteness, the panic set in. I drove him through the blinding coastal mist to a clinic in town. The doctor checked his throat, his ears, his reflexes. Nothing. Physically, he's perfectly healthy, Mr. Vance, the doctor sighed, handing me a bill that made my stomach drop. It's likely psychological mutism. Give him time. But time was the one thing that felt like it was running out. Back in the isolated house, Toby became a ghost who ate breakfast. He would look right through me, his eyes bright, carrying a faint, bemused smile at the corners of his lips. When I begged him to speak, when I knelt before him and held his small hands, asking if he was scared, he would only stare. He didn't look traumatized. He looked occupied, as if he were listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. And then the auditory contagion started. It began in the long, exhausting hours of my insomnia. The rain would lash against the cedar shingles outside, but underneath the storm, I started hearing a rhythm, a wet, heavy, dragging sound. It wasn't on the roof and it wasn't on the floorboards. It was inside the walls. I would press my ear against the bare, exposed drywall of the hallway, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Slither, Click. Slither. It sounded like a massive, skinless serpent shifting its weight behind the structural studs, shadowing my movements from room to room. The climax of that auditory paranoia came on a Thursday night. I was on the kitchen phone, trying to speak to my sister. The static on the line was immense, a roaring tide of white noise. "I'm just so tired, Sarah. I feel like someone is still here." Through the crackling interference, a sound broke through. It wasn't Sarah. It was a short, wet, rhythmic gasping. The sound of someone trying desperately to hold their breath and failing. My blood turned to ice. "Sarah?" I choked out. Is someone else on your line?" "What? No, Marcus, I'm on my cell in the car." Her voice sounded a million miles away. Then I realized the wet breathing wasn't coming from her end of the line. It wasn't coming from the phone speaker at all. It was echoing from the dark, hollow corridor right behind me. I dropped the receiver. It slammed against the floor, dangling by its cord, squawking into the empty room as I sprinted into the dark hallway with a flashlight. Nothing. Just the smell of damp salt water and rotting wood. By the third week, the psychological erosion was absolute. I began checking Toby's body, driven by a compulsive, unhinged need to find a physical symptom for his silence. My old training as an architectural draftsman taught me that if a structure is failing, you look for the fractures. I found my old medical first aid kit from my college days. Inside was a cheap, rusted stethoscope. I sat Toby on the edge of his bed, the same edge where it had sat. The boy didn't flinch. He smiled that vacant, knowing smile as I pressed the cold metal diaphragm against his small, bare chest. I listened. Nothing. I frowned, shifting the metal disc across his sternum, searching for the familiar, comforting thump-thump of a 7-year-old's heart. I pressed harder, moving it to his ribs, to his back, over his lungs. Silence. A hollow, dead, terrifying silence, as if his chest cavity were as empty as an overturned kettle. A violent nausea hit me. I tore the stethoscope from my ears and grabbed Toby by the shoulders, staring into his eyes. "Toby! Toby, look at me!" I screamed, my voice cracking. He just tilted his head, his smile widening by a fraction of a millimeter. He reached up and gently squeezed my trembling hand. His flesh felt warm. His pulse in his wrist felt normal. I looked at the stethoscope in my palm. "It's broken," I told myself, my mind desperately clinging to a raft of sanity. "The rubber tubing is dry-rotted. The diaphragm is cracked. It's just broken." With a choked sob, I hurled the stethoscope into the trash can and pulled my silent son into a desperate, crushing hug, completely unaware that the structural failure wasn't in Toby at all. When you spend your entire life studying blueprints, you develop an instinct for geometry. You understand how lines are supposed to meet, how right angles stabilize a room, and how shadows should fall across a flat surface. But by the 4th week of the silence, the house began to reject its own architecture. The corridors felt longer than the foundations should allow. The unpainted drywall seemed to lean inward just a fraction of a degree, tapering the hallways into narrow, suffocating funnels. I found myself stopping at the thresholds of rooms, staring at the corners where the walls met the ceiling, gripped by a sudden, dizzying conviction that the angles were shifting when my back was turned. Day and night dissolved into a single, exhausting blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind drafted horrific schematics of the house, mapping out the dark, hollow spaces between the studs where the wet, dragging sounds lived. I became consumed by a hyper-fixated paranoia. If I sat in the living room, I knew with absolute skin-crawling certainty that a pale, jointed mass was crouched directly behind the drywall at my back, mirroring my posture. If I walked up the stairs, I could feel a presence slithering upside down beneath the floorboards, shadowing my footsteps. At 3 a.m. on a Friday, the claustrophobia became too heavy to bear. The sea fog was pressing so hard against the windows that the glass creaked under the atmospheric weight. I decided to hunt it. If this entity had stolen the daylight from my life, I would confront it on its own terms, in the absolute dark. I padded barefoot through the skeletal frame of the house, avoiding the floorboards I knew would groan. I carried no flashlight. I let my hands scrape along the rough, tape-and bed mud of the unfinished walls. My target was the spare bedroom, a narrow, drafty closet of a room that lacked paint, carpet, or purpose. It felt like a dead space, a structural tumor. I stepped into the room. The air was freezing, thick with the smell of old plaster and damp salt. When one pale mass crouched behind my back, I stood perfectly still, pressing my knuckles against my lips to stifle my breathing. I listened. Click. Scrape. A sound came from right above me. My gaze flew upward. The single bare light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling flickered once, casting long, erratic shadows across the exposed joists. My breath caught, freezing like ice in my throat. It wasn't hiding in the corners. It was mimicking the structure. Stretched across the horizontal timber beams, 10 feet above the floor, was the entity. Its pale, fluid flesh was pressed flat against the wood, its elongated limbs wrapped around the joists like a grotesque extension of the house's framing. Its backward joints were tucked tightly against its spine, and its featureless, low-slung jaw hung down, dangling just inches above my head like a pale, skinless spider waiting to drop. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just watched as the thing smoothly, silently uncoiled itself with a sickening liquid grace. It didn't fall. It skittered backward into the dark recess where the ceiling met the roof chimney, dissolving into the shadows before the light bulb flickered a second time. A choked, ragged sob escaped my throat. I stumbled backward out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to get Toby. We had to leave. We had to abandon this house, the renovations, everything. I ran down the hall toward his bedroom, but as my hand gripped the brass doorknob, I froze. Through the cheap wood of the door, I heard it. Toby was talking. His voice didn't sound traumatized. It was fluent, clear, and perfectly modulated, carrying a low, rhythmic cadence. He was conversing with someone. I didn't think. I threw my entire weight against the door, bursting into the room. The overhead light flared to life as I slapped the switch. Toby was sitting upright in his bed, his eyes wide, his lips firmly pressed together. The room was dead silent. "Who were you talking to?" I screamed, my voice echoing hollowly off the bare walls. I threw open his closet, ripping his clothes from their hangers, scattering his toys across the floorboards. Nothing. I dragged the toy box away from the wall. Blank drywall. I turned back to the bed, panting, covered in a cold, oily sweat. Toby just watched me. That vacant, bemused smile played at the corners of his lips. He didn't look afraid of my outburst. He looked pitying. I sank onto the edge of the mattress, my knees trembling violently. I reached out, my hands shaking, as I gently brushed his tangled hair away from his face, needing the physical comfort of my son. But as my fingers slipped past his temple, my mind rejected what my eyes were seeing. I pulled him closer, a cold wave of nausea washing over me. I stared at the side of his head, blinking rapidly, praying that the shadows were just playing tricks on my sleep-deprived mind. But they wasn't. Toby didn't have an ear. I frantically spun his head around to check the other side. There was no scar, no incision, no sign of trauma or blood. Where his ears should have been, there was only perfectly smooth, unbroken, featureless flesh. It looked exactly like the pale, blank skin of the thing on the ceiling. My throat closed up. The sound that came out of me wasn't a scream. It was a wet, choked rattle. I scooped Toby into my arms, hauling his weight against my chest. He felt light, grotesquely light, like an armful of dried pine needles in empty fabric. I didn't care about the tools, the renovations, or the fog. I just needed to run. I turned and bolted into the dark hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold timber floorboards, heading straight for the front door. But our path was blocked. Crouched in the center of the narrow corridor, silhouetted against the milky gray fog pressing against the hallway window, was the entity. It squatted on its haunches, its impossibly long, hairless arms wrapped around its knees. It was rocking back and forth with a rhythmic, palsied twitch. The smell of dead salt water and rotting kelp was suffocating. I backed away, squeezing Toby tighter against my ribs. "Get away from him," I croaked, my voice trembling so violently my teeth clicked. "Get out of my house!" Then a voice echoed. It didn't come from the air. It vibrated directly inside the marrow of my own skull. It was a flat, wet sound, broken by erratic clicking hitches. "Daddy." I looked down at Toby. His lips were pressed tightly together. He wasn't moving. The entity's head jerked to the side, a sudden violent tick. "Hello, Daddy." "Shut up!" I screamed, a cold, oily sweat pouring down my neck. "Don't call me that! Leave my family alone!" "But I am your family." The voice inside my head blurred, the syllables overlapping like warped tape. "You invited me." "You're a liar!" I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the cold drywall of the hallway. "I don't know you. I never asked for you." The entity stopped rocking. Its featureless, slung jaw tilted upward, staring at me with a blank face of smooth skin. "Who is Daniel's mother?" it clicked. I blinked, a sudden piercing pain lancing through the center of my forehead. "What? My son's name is Toby. What are you talking about?" "Who is Toby's mother?" It corrected itself, mimicking my own cadence. "How old is he?" He's 7, I stammered, but as the words left my mouth, a terrifying void opened in my chest. 7? Was he? What month was he born? What was his middle name? I searched my mind, clawing through my memories, but there was nothing, just a vast, smooth blankness. "What was his first word?" the entity whispered inside my brain. "Stop it!" I shrieked, pressing my head against the wall. "Stop asking me things!" "You were alone," the entity clicked, its elongated limbs uncoiling as it rose to its full, unnatural height, towering over me in the narrow funnel of the hallway. "You wanted a son, so I made one for you, out of myself." "No," I wept, shaking my head. "No, that doesn't make sense. He's my boy. He's my flesh and blood." "But now," the creature hitched, taking a slow, fluid step towards me, "I need those parts back. I warned you, he could not exist forever. But you do not remember. You forget all the times we have talked." Toby tugged weakly at my collar. I looked down at him, my vision blurring with hot tears. "Toby? Toby, look at me. Open your eyes, buddy. Please." Toby slowly pulled his eyelids up. There were no eyes. Where his bright, expressive gaze should have been, there were only 2 perfectly smooth, shallow depressions of blank, gray flesh. I choked, nearly dropping him, but as I clutched his torso, his small hands suddenly dissolved into his sleeves. His feet rolled up inside his pant cuffs, turning into a fine gray powder that didn't even thud against the floorboards. In a matter of seconds, the weight in my arms vanished entirely. I was holding nothing but a hollow, crumpled pile of children's clothes. No! I dropped to my knees, clawing at the empty fabric. Give him back! Take me instead! Just give him back! I am taking you, the entity whispered. I looked down at my own hands. My fingers, the defined lines of my knuckles, the calluses from my drafting pencils, they were smoothing out. My skin was turning a pale, bloodless gray. I tried to ball my hands into fists, but there were no bones to clench. My wrists were softening, melting into a fluid, featureless mass. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The stethoscope, the empty chest, the missing heartbeat. It wasn't Toby who was the imitation. It was me. I hadn't survived the burnout. I hadn't bought a house to heal. I was just a collection of borrowed marrow and skinless memories built by a grief-stricken child who had made a desperate wish to a horror in the woods a year ago. And now the debt was due. My knees collapsed into gray dust. My chest caved in, entirely empty of a heart, as my consciousness began to fragment and dissolve into the entity's vast, suffocating mind. I watched from a fading, detached perspective as my clothes fell into a heap on the timber floor. The entity stepped forward, its elongated limbs shifting, folding and compacting. The pale, slick flesh hardened and darkened. The backward joints snapped into correct human alignment. Within seconds, it stood up, wearing my face, wearing my voice. It picked up my discarded shirt and slipped it over its new arms. "Thank you," it whispered, using my exact vocal cords. The next morning, the sea fog finally began to lift, letting the pale coastal sun glint off the iron bars of the windows. A car door slammed outside. Elena walked up the porch steps, her coat wrapped tightly against the morning chill. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the kitchen, carrying a bag of groceries. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice bright, filling the hollow spaces of the house. "I brought those paint samples you wanted for Toby's room." The entity stepped out of the dark hallway, a warm, perfectly crafted smile on its face. "Hey, sweetie, that's perfect. We can start on it today." Elena smiled, stepping forward to wrap her arms around its neck, completely missing the faint smell of dead salt water on its skin. "You look a little pale, Marcus. Are you sleeping any better?" "Much better," the entity murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I feel completely renewed." "Good, because I know we said we'd wait until the renovations were done, but being out here in this house, it makes me really wish we could start a family of our own. A little girl, maybe." The entity's eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter in the sunlight, its smile stretching just a little too wide across its face. "I think that can be arranged."